Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. We're going to continue our discussion on fieldwork and strategies. So, when we first think about fieldwork, we have to understand that we try and collect two different types of data. We're looking at quantifiable data and qualitative data. So the quantitative is where we can easily quantify things. What does that mean? Well, basically, can we count it? Can we easily compare it? Can we, say like 25% of the population believes in this, and 15% of the population practice that, right? Those are things that we can take and understand that this fits a given percentage, right? And so that's one way that we look at quantifiable information. Then we have qualitative information, and qualitative information allows us to sort of understand the nuance of that individual's experience. So, we might have, or we might be studying a group of people, and we would look at them and say, okay, so, 15% of this group of people believe this. Well, let's look at who those people are. Can we look at them and define them by, their gender? Are they women? Are they children? Are they adults? Are they part of the elderly? What is their individual experience with this? Do they have stories that can go along with this and explain to us why they believe this particular thing, right? They said, hey, we believe in this. I want to hear the story behind it. And that's where we conduct things like interviews, right? We conduct interviews to find out why. We do life histories, we do participant observation to get into these different types of data and to extract them, right? And to understand the reasoning behind that data, right? If we just say that, well, 15% of this population does this, well, that's one way of looking at it, but that's not a very colorful way of looking at it. That's not understanding the 15%, that's just saying that it exists. If we can understand that 15% and say these are the causes behind it on an individual level, that helps us to get a better picture of that community. Okay, so as an example for this, I want you guys to imagine a chessboard. Okay, so if you've ever played chess, you've got two opponents, and you've got 16 pieces on a board, right? Now, how we would study that game would be both to understand the quantifiable things. So that's, we've got 16 pieces. Half of those pieces are pawns. The other half are unique pieces that are paired, right? So you might have two of each. And then you have like a king and a queen, and then that board that it sits on, right? It's got two different colored checkers, and each one of those has a different relationship. You might have, and how many of those squares are there on that board? Okay, so knowing sort of those demographics, right? That this is how many pieces are here, and this is how they get placed, right? And this is their specific role, right? Then we get into the sort of the qualitative aspect of it. How do those pieces get used, right? How do you use the pawns, right? Pawns are very important, but they have limited motion, right? You can only go so far with them, and you can only go in a certain direction with them unless they are taking another piece. And they are oftentimes sacrificed so that you can get another piece from your opponent, right? What is the strategy that is used when you're playing chess? Those are the things that make chess interesting, and how we would study it as an anthropologist. We would study, again, all the pieces, the board that they're sitting on, how many of them are there, and then we'd also look at the strategy behind it. Like, what do those pieces do? And how would different people use their own strategy to accomplish their goals, right? So that's one way of looking at quantifiable and qualitative data. Okay, so this is something that I would like you to take a little bit of time and sort of think about. So pick some sort of a subject, you know, political, religious, community, anything you would like. And I want you to think about how you would use qualitative and quantitative methods to analyze an aspect of that culture. The example that I use is Christianity. So if we look at Christianity and we look at it from a quantifiable, quantitative approach, we would want to know, like, how many people practice it, right? How many years has it been practiced? How many years is the average person that's in Christianity, how many years have they been involved in it? What ages do they usually start in it? What percentage of a population practices that religion, right? Those are all quantifiable questions that we can ask. Now, the qualitative stuff would be, how does practicing it have an impact on your life? How does practicing Christianity increase or decrease your level of happiness? What kind of benefits do you get? What are the drawbacks? How do you see other religions, right? These are all things that, on an individual scale, we can see how people are going to react. What can we anticipate from the group if, say, like 80% of the people give the same answer, right? So we can sort of combine these two things. So what I want you to do for this is, and maybe pick your own project, right? The project that you're going to complete by the end of the semester. Think about that subject and do this as sort of like just a quick exercise on how would you want to learn about the quantifiable stuff and the qualitative stuff, and start thinking about it in those different ways. Okay, so take a couple minutes and write something down, and then we'll go from there. Okay. Okay, we're back. Okay, so one of the things that, one of the strategies that we use is to become a participant observer. Now, a participant observer is someone that engages in the community as a normal community member. So, if I say I was interested in mechanics, right, car culture, I might go work for a mechanic. And I'd say, okay, I want to understand how mechanics live, right? How does this particular shop operate? You know, so I would go to work with them. I would be trained by them. I would say, okay, so, you know, what are these tools? What is the language that's used? What is, you know, you start working on a car, and then the mechanic says, well, I need to replace the pitman arms, or the catalytic converter, or the lightning whirler, or whatever, right? You end up learning about the intricacies of that community, of that culture, right? You start paying attention to those things, and then you start learning them. And then you can practice those things yourself. And that gives you that hands-on knowledge, not only about the work that is being done, but the people that are doing that kind of work. What is their experience like? You have someone that brings in a car and they say, I've got this noise and I don't know what it is. And you're like, okay, that doesn't really help, but let's go find out. And then you go and find out, and you pay attention to the knowledge that has been gained over the years, and how they feel about those people that come in and say, I've got this noise and I don't know what it is. Well, why don't you know what it is? Right? The interactions, the intricacies of what it's like to live and work in that role. Right? So you become one with that, right? You're able to pick up a wrench and start wrenching on stuff and see what it's like to learn that process. In this process of doing this, you create key informants. Okay, these are the individuals that are going to help you along the way. And they're going to be the gatekeepers, oftentimes, to get you access to the things that you're going to need, right? To possibly other people, to information that might be unavailable to you because you're brand new or they don't trust you, right? And that's where key informants come into place. You get to know them, you start talking to them, you start learning about what it is that they're doing, why they're doing it, and you engage in that conversation. And you build this rapport, right? You know, in some cases, create a friendship as one way of looking at it, and then that helps to sort of get you to a more trusted position, right? Because a lot of times, you know, if you walk into a culture, they don't know you, they don't trust you. Why do they have any reason to trust you? And that's part of the objective of being a participant observer, is to integrate yourself into the community, gain the trust of those community members, so that they will open up doors to more information later on. But that sort of, it takes time. It takes time to build trust. And that really is what it is. It's one of those things that you have to have trust before you can actually gain that really quality information. Because on occasion, you might ask a question, you haven't earned that trust, and so they will give you an answer that is not correct. But you have to trust that they are giving you that information correctly. And so that when later on, when you learn, because you've developed that trust and you've built up that rapport, and you actually find out the true answer to that, sometimes we can get miffed about it, right? Well, you lied to me. Well, they didn't have any reason to tell you the truth, right? You didn't have that trust. Something to consider when you're out there talking to other people, right? Do they trust you? Are they going to tell you the truth? Or are they going to tell you what they think you want to know? And that's also something that has to be taken into consideration. We have structured or formal interviews. And these, when I'm conducting my own research, this is one of the things that I'll oftentimes sort of set up first. After I've been in the community for a while, learning about the community, building that trust, and now I've got a specific set of questions that I want to ask. So I will create a structured interview. And I'll usually have multiple participants. For your project, you're going to need just 2 participants. You can have more, but the minimum will be 2. So that's take it like that. So let's say you've got 2 people that you're going to be interviewing. You're going to create a series of questions, a battery of questions, and you're going to essentially tell those questions to each of your participants, right? And this is a good chance for you to get that quantitative information, right? This is stuff that you can ask everyone, and everyone should have a pretty basic answer to those questions. You don't want them to really dive too deep, Um, but you want something that is kind of concise, something that can be easily comparable, right? So you develop questions around that. And you can get both really good qualitative and quantitative information from this. What's really important is what happens next. So, oh, yes, this is important that happens next, but that's not what I was going to talk about. So what I want you to do real quick is to develop some questions about your own project and take a couple minutes to write some questions down. What do you want to know? How do you want to sort of go forth? What are the things that you're interested in? Right? What do you want to know about this community people that you're going to be researching? So think about some questions, right? Write those down. I'm going to open up a discussion for this. So what you can do is include a couple of your questions and get some responses. I want you to look at someone else's posted questions and think about that. You know, how would you answer it? Can you think of a better way of asking it? You know, try and figure out how you might engage in that conversation. I want you guys to kind of work with each other a little bit on creating better questions to ask. Okay. Now, of course, this is early on, and so I'm not expecting, you know, final questions that you're going to be asking. This is a spitballing session in which you're going to think about some of your stuff, some questions that you want to have asked, and then have people respond. What would you want to know about that? You know, include your the project that you want to work on. I'm going to be studying this group of people. These are some of the questions that I have. And you might say, hey, if I were studying them, I'd want to ask these questions too, right? So, you know, comment on something that you would like to know about that culture as well, that someone else is working on. Okay, so take a moment to do that, and you know, if it's done this week or next week or the week after, just include questions and answers. Look back every once in a while, see if someone has responded, and just take an opportunity to do this. Okay, moving on. So, as a result of creating those formal questions, right? Those questions that you want to initially start off with. Your second round of interviews, right? And this is what I want you guys to be doing during your projects, right? When you start going out there and talking to people, you'll, you know, interview them first, do that formal interview, then you'll conduct informal interviews. And one of the things that you're going to do after you conduct that formal interview is you're going to take their answers and you're going to analyze them. What did I learn from this? Now, here's the interesting thing. Not everybody gives the same answer, right? So you're going to take those answers and create new questions. Now, in informal interviews, they're usually not done in the same setting, right? A formal interview, you might sit down and actually have pen and paper and write down their responses. And in an informal interview, you can still write things down, but a lot of times it's done in an informal setting. Maybe you're at work, maybe you're at the gym, you're in the park, wherever it is that you're deciding to have this conversation, having lunch, right? And then you start a conversation. But you start thinking about the answers that they gave previously, and then you use those to create new questions. And then you ask those questions in a very open-ended way. And this is what makes it sort of informal, is that you are trying to get them to extrapolate on their answers, right? Instead of giving me, you know, short, succinct answers, I want you to explain, right? You told me this in the previous interview. Can we go more in depth into that, right? You explained this. How about this? How does this work? You know, can I, and then if you've got a question while they're talking about it, throw in that question, right? But allow yourself to give them space to talk, right? And allow that flow to take place. So it gives you a chance to get a different type of information, to go in depth. It also gives you a chance to, say you get a response from one person in the formal interviews, and you get a very different response from someone else. Now you can use this opportunity to say, hey, I had an additional question. I'm curious as to why you said this and not that, right? And so you can sort of do a comparative analysis. But it's also a really good time to have those conversations and not have it seem so formal, right? Hanging out and just figuring out an easy and relaxed way of doing things instead of having it to be so formal. We also conduct life histories. And a life history is a type of interview, but it's not just an interview. It allows us to understand their life's experience, right? If you're talking to an elder versus someone that's, say, in their 20s, they're going to have very different experiences, right? That elder is going to be able to say, oh, I experienced this when I was a youngster, and I had to do this, and I had to do that. And it can give a lot of generational information of how things have changed or how things have stayed the same. And then you can compare that to other life histories, right? This person said this. This person, who's 50 years younger, said this, right? And how are those things either the same or different, right? It also allows us to kind of understand things like power dynamics. What's changed? Who's got the influence? Who doesn't have the influence? Different relationships between families, right? This family did this, and my aunt and uncle, they did that. And all of a sudden, you can start piecing things together. So learning about those experiences. You want to kind of understand their experience growing up, becoming an adult. What were their goals and aspirations? Did they meet those goals and aspirations? Right? All of those kinds of things about what it takes to become an adult. What is your occupation? Do you have a job? What is that job? You know, or if you don't have jobs, what is your occupation, right? You might think about jobs, especially in an American sense. You know, we go to school, we learn these basic skills, we might go to college, learn another set of more specialized skills, and then we go into the world and apply those skills. But what happens if you go to a community where they don't have the same type of education, they don't have the same sort of job prospects or diversity in jobs? You know, what are they going to do? What if you go into a community that's a horticulturalist or nomadic herders, right? Well, you don't need to know all about trigonometry to be a sheep herder, right? So that education might not be there. But understanding animals and animal behavior, that becomes really important. So, right, learning those different aspects of life, right? And we can sort of gather that information through this process of doing a life history. Then we can do things like surveys, you know, real quick. Hey, I've got 10, 15 questions that I'm going to pass out to everybody. And that can be like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about this? You know, would you do this, yes or no, right? Those are basically surveys. Have you experienced this? right? And if so, scale it. And that gives us a really good sense of quantifiable information, right? Out of these 25 participants, you know, the average on this particular answer was 85%, and they all agreed. But on this question, you know, only half of the people agreed. Why? Why is that different? So we might conduct surveys to get sort of a baseline of information that allows us to, you know, and oftentimes create new questions to ask on a more direct level with individuals. Then we have kinship analysis. Kinship, oftentimes we think of like family, who we are related to, what is our lineage. In kinship, and we'll get into this when we cover kinship, goes beyond that. It goes beyond just family and blood relations, but it's all the people in our lives that we are deeply connected to. So if we look at kinship, we can look at those interlocking relationships. How do different families, different groups of people interact, and what is that structure, right? Not everybody has the same family structure that we have. You know, again, we'll talk about this more later, but we live in a system where we have, you know, we have mom and dad, and then we've got their parents, and then we might have aunts and uncles, and then we have cousins. Well, there are cultures out there that say you've got mom and dad, and your dad's brother has essentially the same role in your family as your dad does. They have the same rights and responsibility. In fact, you would call him father, right? Instead of having uncle, you would actually call him father. You've got two fathers, right? And their kids, right? Your uncle, their kids are not considered your cousins. They're considered your brothers and sisters. And even though in our society they would be your first cousins, you know, in this community they're treated like your brothers and sisters. And your dad's brother, he's not your uncle, he's also your father, which means he can do all the same things that your father would do to either congratulate you or to punish you, right? And you would treat his kids like you would your own brother or sister. Changes the rules, right? So if we understand that, if we understand those behaviors and these different cultures and how they look at things, and again, we'll do a deep dive into that later on in the semester, we can understand how those folks are more than likely to behave given at their circumstances. Right, so again, so it helps us to define even the term family, right? And how we see family, how different cultures see family, and what that can do to a community. We also conduct social network analysis, and that's sort of the connection between ourselves and our neighbors. So you might not have a lot of familiar, right, family in that area. To give an example, okay, so let's say that your nearby community experienced a flood, okay? Who are going to be the people that come to help deal with the damage that that flood has, right? So within our own social networks, we can, we can use Fort Collins as an example. When there is heavy-duty flooding here or in Boulder, right, you had nearest neighbors coming out and saying, okay, let's get our fire trucks and our rescue vehicles, and we're going to go out there and we're going to help immediately. And you've got people coming in from Denver and other parts of the state that are helping. The further you move away, that social network starts to diminish, right? So a lot of your social networks are usually fairly close in immediate places. So Boulder and Fort Collins. There might be some rivalry there, but there's also a sense of similarity, a sense of community, right? There are more things that bring those two different communities together than there are the things that drive them apart. And so when that call for help comes out, who's going to respond, right? And so that's one of the things that we can look at, you know, as far as like social networks. How do people respond given different circumstances? I have an overabundance of food, right? I have been harvesting food, and I've got this great bounty, and I'm not going to be able to eat all of it. So who do I reach out to give those resources to, right? We would look at those sort of social network aspects to understand what that community looks like and how they behave in either times of need or in times of bounty. Okay, so field notes. This is important to understand that while you're doing all this research, you gotta collect your notes. And there's two different ways that we are oftentimes looking at conducting field notes. One is, what are you finding, right? I have two notebooks. Whenever I do research, I have two notebooks. One notebook is just my observations. What am I seeing? What am I learning about this community? It's like, oh, I saw this happen today, and I'm curious about it, and I need to ask more questions about it. I learned this because I observed this happening, and then I went and got answers, and here's that explanation. That's one notebook. The other notebook is about your own personal experience. It's your journal. Today, when I was doing this research, I felt a lot of anxiety while I was doing it. I felt out of place. I was having issues. I was feeling culture shock. So this is what I did to deal with those issues. And then you connect the two, right? The researcher is directly connected to the research. So depending on what is being done, who is saying what, all of those things have an impact on people and how they're going to respond. Okay? So we have to keep that in mind. When we're doing notes, when we're collecting that information, collect not just the facts, but connect how you got those facts and how you felt about those facts. Right. And then with those notebooks, say after a month, you're like, you know what? I've learned some new things. How does that compare to what I learned before? You go back to your notes and you read your notes and do that comparison. What changed? What have you learned? Are things still the same? Has relationships changed? Right? So you go back and review those notes. And you do that on a fairly regular basis. And then it also gives you time to ponder, right? You write it down, and then you, like a slow cooker, you just let it sit and stew a little bit, and allows you to think about things in different ways, right? That's also really important. And then it's also good for just making basic observations. What is the food like? What is the clothing that people are wearing? What's the weather out like? What time of day am I doing this? All of these things are important to record. It might not seem like it. Does it matter what time of day it is? Absolutely. Right? Let's say you're in a public square, and during the day, people go there and they have lunch, and you're sitting there and you might interview a few people, talk to them, and have lunch yourself, and that's it. But then at night, it turns into a festival, right? You've got people coming out, and they're celebrating, and there's different stuff going on. Well, you're going to have different people. You're going to have different environments, different situations. That place, same place in both that morning and evening, but what happens there can be very different. right? Say you go into a church, right? You go into a church during a sermon, right? You got lots of people, they're all in the pews, and they're all listening to the preacher, and the preacher's going on about this. And then you come back later when there's nobody there. Who do you have access to? Who's still there? Is there anyone that's hanging out for whatever reason? Now you've got access to that preacher, right? So time can be a really important thing to consider when you're thinking about when you're doing this. Even when you're conducting your interviews, time becomes really important. If you're going to do your interviews late at night, might not be the best time to do it because people have had a full day. They're tired. Maybe they're hungry, right? Their responses can be dictated by their biological need to sleep and to eat, right? So you might talk to them in the evening and then talk to them the next day during the day, and you might get very different responses. And it can be because of their biological clock, right? So when you're conducting those interviews, add the time, right? And all of those things, right? The food, the smells, it's all information. And that's what we're trying to collect, is all of the information. All right, mapping. Now, mapping sounds daunting, and it's funny because we map things all the time. Because it's how we learn about our world, right? But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making conscious notes about the spaces that we're in. Right, so thinking about the environment, one of the first things that you're going to do is you're going to map it. Sometimes it's just as easy as a basic sketch. You first mental map it. You're like, okay, so this is this part of the community over here, and this is where the houses is over here. If I'm going to say, like, as an example, I'll use Toyac, again on the Ute Mountain Reservation. When I go onto the reservation, I'm going to be looking for the houses. Where are the houses? How closely are they spaced? Where is the civic center? Right? What are the closest buildings to the civic center? There's a recreation center that's really close to it. There's the library. What is the central area where people congregate? And then what do the neighborhoods look like surrounding that area? And then also, what does the environment look like? It's a semi-arid desert. So what is the flora and fauna? Right? What are the things that live there? What about tree cover? Right? All of these different things can impact a culture, right? And what they have access to. So you want to record all of those things. Even in that course of mapping, think about that space and how it's being used and how many people are using it at any given time during the day. If I'm looking at the recreation center, it's like, okay, so we got, in the morning and early afternoon, I got a lot of kids that are there. Late afternoon, those kids disappear. Oh, I'm getting a bunch of adults coming in. Like, what are those adults doing? So you're not only mapping the space, but the time that space is being used and how it's changing its use, right? So that's something that you have to understand. Then you can look at things like the distribution of resources, right? Who's got the nicest house? Who has the poorest house? Where are those places in relation to the civic center or to each other, right? Who owns those locations? And you start figuring out sort of like the power dynamics for each one of those groups and how they are experiencing that community. And then it's always good, after you've done that sort of initial mapping, go back and remap it, right? Now that you've been there for like a month or two, or you're going back, you're experiencing something new, you go back and check it out again. What did I miss? You know, what are some of the more details that I need to know that I didn't pick up the first time? You know, now that I've talked to some folks, now that I've got a better understanding of the community, what else is there, right? So, you know, go out and do that. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we'll continue in a few minutes, or days, depends on when you watch the next video. Okay, see you then.